What if the man responsible for saving Western Europe nearly lost everything, not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of command, and the President of the United States had to make a decision that could have ended one of the greatest military careers in American history? The year was 1951. The Korean War was consuming American lives at a staggering rate. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had just been recalled from retirement to serve as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the man tasked with building NATO into a credible fighting force against Soviet expansion. But within the first 72 hours of a critical command review, 3 catastrophic failures of coordination had emerged. Failures that reached the desk of President Harry S. Truman on a cold January morning in Washington, D.C. Truman, a man who had already fired one legendary general less than a year before, was now staring at a report that could force him to make another impossible choice. The failures were not small administrative oversights. They involved intelligence breakdowns, logistical miscommunications, and a breakdown in the chain of command that stretched from Paris to Frankfurt to the Pentagon. The stakes could not have been higher. The security of Western Europe, the credibility of the newly formed Atlantic Alliance, and the political survival of Truman's presidency all hung in the balance. History remembers Eisenhower as a calm, unshakable leader, but the truth of those 72 hours tells a far more complicated and deeply human story. And what Truman said when the full report landed on his desk was something that very few people outside the White House ever knew. This is that story, told in full, for the first time, from the real historical record. If you believe that the hidden moments of history are just as important as the famous ones, if you think the decisions made behind closed doors shape the world we live in today, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. And leave a comment below telling us what you already knew about Eisenhower's time as NATO commander, because what comes next may completely change what you thought you knew. The story begins not in Korea, not in Washington, but in a modest headquarters building in Rocancourt, France, just outside Paris, where General Dwight David Eisenhower officially assumed command of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, known as SHAPE, on April 2, 1951. Eisenhower had not wanted the job at first. He had retired from active military duty in 1948 after serving as Army Chief of Staff, and by 1950 he was the president of Columbia University, attempting to live a quieter life of academic administration. But the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 and the Soviet Union's increasingly aggressive posture in Europe changed everything. President Truman called him personally and told him that only one man had the international prestige and military credibility to hold the fractious NATO alliance together, and that man was Eisenhower. He accepted the mission with characteristic duty, but he arrived in Europe to find a command structure that was, by every honest assessment, a bureaucratic disaster. The 12 member nations of NATO had wildly different military doctrines, languages, communication protocols, and political priorities. The British wanted to retain independent command of their Rhine army. The French were consumed by their war in Indochina and could barely commit to European defense. The smaller nations, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, had armies that were under-equipped, under-trained, and skeptical that America would actually defend them if the Soviets moved west. Eisenhower spent his first weeks simply traveling from capital to capital, shaking hands and making promises, trying to convince European leaders that NATO was not a paper alliance. But beneath the diplomatic surface, the command structure he was inheriting was riddled with fault lines, and those fault lines were about to crack open in the most damaging way possible. The first command failure occurred on January 7, 1951, though its roots stretched back to decisions made in late November and December of 1950, during the darkest days of the Korean War, when Chinese forces had entered the conflict and sent United Nations troops reeling southward in a catastrophic retreat. That retreat triggered an emergency review of NATO's war plans, because American military planners suddenly realized that the same doctrine of static defense they had relied upon in Korea was equally flawed in Europe. SHAPE headquarters ordered an urgent intelligence assessment of Soviet ground forces positioned along the inner German border, the fortified line separating East and West Germany that ran for nearly 900 miles from the Baltic Sea to Czechoslovakia. The assessment was supposed to integrate intelligence from American, British, and French sources, cross-referenced against signals intelligence gathered by the newly reorganized Army Security Agency. But the coordination between these 3 intelligence streams completely broke down. The British MI6 liaison at SHAPE failed to transmit a critical update from their Berlin station, an update indicating that 3 Soviet armored divisions previously assessed as being in reserve had been moved forward to forward staging positions near Erfurt in East Germany. The American G2 intelligence office at SHAPE did not catch the omission because their own internal review process had been suspended during the holiday period. The French liaison provided outdated order of battle information that was based on assessments from October 1950, more than 2 months old. The result was an intelligence picture presented to Eisenhower that dramatically underestimated the immediate Soviet threat to West Germany, and this flawed intelligence had already been transmitted to the Pentagon and to NATO's national military representatives before anyone realized the error. The second command failure hit on January 8, 1951, just 24 hours later, and it involved the logistics pipeline that was supposed to sustain any NATO response force in the event of a Soviet advance into West Germany. By the terms agreed upon at the Brussels Conference of 1950, the United States had committed to deploying 4 additional divisions to Europe by the spring of 1951, a commitment that Truman had made as a gesture of American seriousness toward the alliance. These divisions were drawn from the Army's strategic reserve in the continental United States, and their movement to Europe required coordination between the Department of the Army, the Military Sea Transportation Service, the European Command's logistics staff, and the newly created Shape Supply Directorate. On January 8, Eisenhower's logistics chief, Brigadier General Reuben Jenkins, discovered that a critical communications failure between the Pentagon's G4 Logistics Office and the Military Sea Transportation Service had resulted in shipping allocations being made based on an outdated troop manifest. 3 transport vessels, the USNS General William Weigel, the USNS General Harry Taylor, and a 3rd chartered civilian vessel, had been loaded according to a division table of organization that had been superseded by a revised TONE issued in September 1950. This meant that entire categories of heavy equipment, including tank recovery vehicles, bridge-laying units, and communications vehicles, had simply not been included in the shipping manifest. If those ships had sailed without correction, an entire American division would have arrived in Bremerhaven, West Germany, without the equipment it needed to function as a combat-ready force. It was a failure that could have left a gaping hole in NATO's defensive line at precisely the moment when the alliance was trying to demonstrate to both the Soviets and to wavering European governments that it was a credible fighting force. The third failure arrived on January 9, 1951, and in some ways it was the most politically dangerous of the 3, because it did not involve equipment or intelligence but rather the chain of command itself. General Eisenhower had established a clear protocol for communications between SHAPE and the national military commands of the alliance members. All operational communications were to flow through SHAPE's Combined Operations Center, to be logged, translated, and distributed according to a standardized procedure designed to prevent misunderstandings between allies who did not share a common language or a common military doctrine. But on January 9, the French Army's Chief of Staff, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, a proud, difficult, and brilliantly capable officer who had led Free French forces in the liberation of France and had only recently returned from Vietnam, where he had stabilized the French position against the Viet Minh, sent a direct communication to the West German government's newly created Military Liaison Office that bypassed SHAPE entirely. The message concerned the proposed integration of West German soldiers into a European defense force, a question of enormous political sensitivity, because the idea of rearming Germany just 6 years after the end of World War II was deeply controversial in France, in Britain, and across the continent. De Latter's communication, sent without Eisenhower's knowledge or approval, contained language that suggested France was prepared to offer West Germany a specific and limited role in European defense that had not been agreed upon by the alliance as a whole. When Eisenhower learned of the communication, he was furious, not because the French position was inherently unreasonable, but because the communication had been made outside the established protocol and had potentially committed NATO to a negotiating position that had never been collectively endorsed. By the morning of January 10, 1951, all 3 failures had been documented and compiled into a formal report by Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Alfred Gruenther, one of the most capable staff officers in the American Army, a man known for his precise, analytical mind and his ability to distill complex operational problems into clear, actionable summaries. Gruenther worked through the night of January 9th to assemble the full picture, working alongside British and American intelligence officers at the SHAPE Command Center in Roccancourt, his staff cross-referencing cables, logistics manifests, and communication logs to establish a complete and accurate timeline of what had gone wrong and why. The report was not a document that assigned individual blame in the manner of a court-martial charge sheet. Gruenther and Eisenhower both understood that in the complex, multinational, improvisational world of a newly formed alliance, institutional failures were rarely the product of a single individual's negligence. Rather, the report identified systemic weaknesses, gaps in communication protocol, ambiguities in the command structure, insufficient standardization of intelligence procedures, and the absence of a unified logistics tracking system that could flag discrepancies in real time. It was, in many ways, A brutally honest self-assessment of an institution that was barely 6 months old and that was being asked to perform functions that would have challenged even a mature, well-established military command. Grunther attached his own recommendations, 12 specific corrective actions, each with a designated responsible officer and a timeline for implementation. And then, with the document sealed, he transmitted it directly to the Pentagon, where it was flagged for immediate attention by Army Chief of Staff General J. Lawton Collins, and from Collins, it went directly to Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, and from Marshall, it went to the desk of the President. Harry S. Truman received the Grunther report on the afternoon of January 10, 1951, in the Oval Office. He read it in full. Truman was famous for reading everything himself, refusing to rely solely on oral briefings or summaries prepared by aides. He had been a senator, a vice president, and a president, and he knew from long experience that the most important details were always in the fine print. What he read did not make him comfortable. Less than 9 months earlier, on April 11, 1951, he had made the most politically agonizing decision of his presidency: the firing of General Douglas MacArthur, who had publicly contradicted Truman's Korean War policy and had communicated with Republican congressional leaders in a manner that Truman considered a direct challenge to civilian control of the military. The firing had nearly destroyed Truman politically. His approval ratings had plummeted. MacArthur had returned home to ticker-tape parades and an address to a joint session of Congress, and Republicans in the Senate had called for Truman's impeachment. And now, barely 9 months later, the man he had appointed to lead NATO's military structure was reporting 3 simultaneous command failures in the most critical theater in the world. The political implications were staggering. If these failures became public, they would be used by Truman's opponents, led by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who had consistently opposed NATO and the deployment of additional American troops to Europe, as evidence that the entire alliance was a costly, chaotic failure. And yet Truman also understood, with a clarity that only comes from years of difficult leadership, that how he responded to this moment would define not just his presidency, but the future of the alliance itself. If you are still watching, if this story of command, pressure, and high-stakes decision-making is speaking to you, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and like this video. Every subscription and every like tells us that you want more stories like this one, stories that go beyond the headlines and dig into the real decisions, the real pressures, and the real human beings who shaped our world. Share this video with a friend who loves military history or political history, and leave a comment below telling us, did you know that Eisenhower faced this kind of command crisis in his very first weeks at NATO? Your comment means more than you know. Truman did not immediately call Eisenhower. He did not fire off a telegram demanding explanations or threatening consequences. Instead, he did something that his critics rarely gave him credit for. He thought carefully before he acted. He summoned Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff J. Lawton Collins, and his National Security Advisor, Averell Harriman, to the White House for a meeting that lasted nearly 3 hours on the evening of January 10th. Marshall, the man who had conceived the European Recovery Program, who had served as Army Chief of Staff throughout World War II, and who commanded perhaps more respect from Truman than any other man alive, spoke first. He told Truman that the failures described in the Grunther report were serious, but not catastrophic. They were the inevitable growing pains of an institution that was being built from nothing, in real time, under the pressure of a deteriorating global security environment. Marshall reminded Truman of the chaos that had characterized American military command in the first months of World War II, the confusion at the War Department after Pearl Harbor, the miscommunications during the North Africa campaign, the intelligence failures that had preceded the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. Every large military organization, Marshall argued, went through a period of painful self-correction before it found its operational footing. The question was not whether SHAPE had failed. It clearly had, in 3 specific and documented ways. The question was whether the institution and its leadership were capable of learning from those failures and correcting them. And on that question, Marshall told Truman clearly and directly. He believed Eisenhower was exactly the right man for the job, and that removing or publicly reprimanding him would do far more damage to NATO's credibility than the failures themselves. Collins agreed with Marshall, but added a critical operational dimension that Truman needed to hear. The 4 divisions being deployed to Europe were still months away from being fully operational. The logistics failure had been caught in time, and the corrected shipping manifests could be implemented without major delay. The intelligence failure was more serious, but British and American intelligence officers were already working to correct the Soviet order of battle assessment, and the corrected picture would be distributed to NATO's national commands within 72 hours. The political failure, the latter's unauthorized communication to the West Germans, was being quietly managed through diplomatic channels, with the French government already signaling its willingness to clarify that de Lattre had been speaking in a personal capacity rather than on behalf of the NATO alliance. Harriman, for his part, told Truman that the Europeans were watching, that any sign of American disarray at shape would immediately be exploited by Soviet propaganda and would strengthen the hand of political movements in France, Italy, and West Germany that were opposed to NATO and sympathetic to accommodation with Moscow. The most important thing Truman could do, Harriman argued, was to publicly reaffirm his confidence in Eisenhower, to send a signal to both the European allies and to the Soviets that the United States was not going to be rattled by the inevitable difficulties of building a new international military structure. After 3 hours of deliberation, Truman made his decision. He picked up the secure telephone line to Rockencourt and placed a personal call to Eisenhower. The conversation between Truman and Eisenhower on the evening of January 10, 1951 was not recorded verbatim. No transcript exists in the Truman Presidential Library, and neither man described it in complete detail in their memoirs. But from the accounts of those who were present in the Shape Command Center when Eisenhower received the call, including Alfred Grunther and Eisenhower's aide, Colonel Paul Carroll, and from the contemporaneous notes made by Averell Harriman, who was present at Truman's end of the conversation, a reasonably complete picture of what was said can be reconstructed. Truman opened the conversation by telling Eisenhower that he had read the Grunther report in full and that he understood the difficulties involved. He did not express anger. He did not issue ultimatums. Instead, he told Eisenhower, in the direct, plain-spoken language that was Truman's signature style, that he had not sent him to Europe to run a perfect organization because no such thing existed. He told him that he had sent him to build something that had never been built before, a genuine multinational military alliance with real teeth, real command authority, and real deterrent power. He told Eisenhower that the 3 failures documented in the report were serious, and that he expected them to be corrected, but that he had complete confidence in Eisenhower's ability to make those corrections. And then Truman said something that Grunther later described as the most important thing any American president had said to any military commander in the post-war era. He told Eisenhower that the world was watching, that history was watching, and that the difference between a great commander and an ordinary one was not whether things went wrong, things always went wrong, but whether the commander had the character to fix them without losing sight of the larger mission. Eisenhower was visibly moved by the call. Grunther, who was standing nearby when Eisenhower replaced the receiver, later wrote in his private diary, a document not declassified until 1981, that Eisenhower sat quietly for nearly 2 minutes after the call ended before speaking. When he finally spoke, he said, "That man has more guts than anyone gives him credit for." It was a characteristic Eisenhower response, understated, direct, and revealing in its simplicity. For Eisenhower, Truman's call was not merely reassuring, it was clarifying. It reminded him of why the mission mattered, and it gave him the political backing he needed to make the difficult institutional changes that the Grunther report demanded. Within 48 hours of Truman's call, Eisenhower had convened a full meeting of the SHAPE Standing Group, the representatives of the major NATO powers, and had presented them with a revised command protocol that addressed all 3 of the failures identified in the report. The new protocol established a unified intelligence coordination cell, staffed by officers from all 12 member nations, with a standardized reporting format and a mandatory cross-verification procedure that required all intelligence assessments to be reviewed by at least 2 national intelligence representatives before transmission. It established a joint logistics tracking center that maintained real-time visibility over all NATO-bound shipments, with automated discrepancy flags triggered whenever a manifest did not match the approved table of organization. And it established an explicit written protocol for all communications between national military commands and third-party governments, a protocol that required all such communications to be routed through SHAPE and to receive prior approval from the Supreme Commander's Office. The reforms that Eisenhower implemented in January and February of 1951 did not attract much attention at the time. They were buried in the operational details of alliance management, far from the front pages of newspapers that were focused on the fighting in Korea and the political drama of Truman's confrontation with MacArthur. But in the longer arc of history, those reforms were foundational. The Unified Intelligence Coordination Cell that Eisenhower established in January 1951 became the model for what eventually evolved into NATO's Intelligence Fusion Center. The Joint Logistics Tracking System became the precursor to the NATO Maintenance and Supply Agency. The communications protocol that ended the kind of freelancing that de Lattre had engaged in became the basis for NATO's standardized agreement procedures, the STANAGs that still govern alliance operations today. Eisenhower left the SHAPE Command in May 1952 to return to the United States and pursue the Republican presidential nomination, He won the presidency that November, defeating Democrat Adlai Stevenson in a landslide. But the institutional architecture he built at SHAPE in those early, chaotic months endured long after he left. When he became president in January 1953, he inherited a NATO alliance that was significantly more coherent, more capable, and more credible than the one he had found when he arrived in Rockencourt 2 years earlier, and a significant part of that transformation could be traced directly to the crisis of those 72 hours in January 1951, and to the character of both the general and the president who faced it together. Truman left the presidency on January 20, 1953, when Eisenhower was inaugurated. The two men had a complex and sometimes tense relationship. They had clashed over MacArthur, over Korea, over campaign politics when Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, but on the fundamental question of NATO and the defense of Western Europe, they had been partners in the deepest sense of the word. Truman's decision in January 1951 not to make a public issue of the SHAPE command failures, not to demand heads on platters, not to use the crisis as a political weapon against his own generals, was one of the quietest and least celebrated decisions of his presidency, and one of the most consequential. Because if he had responded differently, if he had called for a public investigation, or demanded the removal of the officers responsible for the intelligence and logistics failures, or allowed the story to leak to the press as a way of deflecting attention from his own political difficulties, the fragile NATO alliance might well have fractured before it ever found its footing. The European governments that were watching for any sign of American unreliability would have had their worst fears confirmed. The Soviet Union, whose intelligence services were almost certainly monitoring the early dysfunction at SHAPE, would have concluded that the alliance was too divided and too incompetent to pose a serious obstacle to Soviet ambitions in Central Europe. And the course of the Cold War, the entire geopolitical architecture of the second half of the 20th century, might have been fundamentally different. Instead, Truman chose steadiness over drama, institutional confidence over political expediency, and long-term strategy over short-term optics. It was not a glamorous choice. It did not make headlines. But it may have been the choice that saved the Western Alliance. History has a way of remembering the dramatic moments, the speeches, the battles, the firings, the victories, and forgetting the quieter decisions that made everything else possible. The story of those 72 hours in January 1951, of the 3 command failures that reached Truman's desk and the phone call that followed, is one of those forgotten stories. It tells us something essential about what real leadership looks like, not the leadership of the parade ground or the campaign rally, but the leadership of the moment when everything is going wrong and the easy choices are all the wrong choices, and the person at the top has to find the discipline to do the hard, unsexy, institutionally correct thing even when the political incentives are pointing in the opposite direction. Eisenhower went on to become one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century. Truman is consistently ranked among America's greatest presidents by historians. But perhaps the truest measure of both men is not the monuments or the rankings. It is this story, this moment, these 72 hours when the alliance that has kept Europe at peace for more than 7 decades nearly came apart before it had properly begun, and 2 men with very different personalities and very different political interests chose, together, to hold it together. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about leadership, about history, about the decisions that shape our world, then please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave us a comment below. What surprised you most about this story? What did you learn today that you didn't know before? Your voice matters, and every comment, every share, every subscription helps us bring more stories like this one to the people who need them most.